Hello and welcome back to another video. Today I want to do this super simple landscape that anyone can do with me. So whether you're brand new to watercolors, maybe you just got some for the holidays and you want to know how to use them, then this video is for you. So I'm going to break this down step by step, but first I want to have a look at our colors before we start anything at all, because we're just going to use one color to do this. So I would say pick your favorite color, but I want you to be mindful of one thing. So if you look at my yellow here, my hands are yellow, this is my lightest color or lightest value on here. And the scale between our lightest value of the yellow and the darkest of the yellow isn't that great compared to a darker color like neutral tint or indigo, where I can get a much wider range of colors within that one color. So that's why I would say choose, somewhat of a darker color when you're doing something like this, because if you choose a yellow, you're not going to get as much contrast between the lighter areas and the darker areas. But you know what? Just have fun with this, especially if you're just beginning, and pick whatever color you want. I think I'm going to go with my phthalo blue today. Okay, so I'm going to do my sketching here in real time with you so you can sketch along with me. And what we want to do is just create some mountains here. Now, we don't want our first mountain to be right in the middle of the page. You want to create a little bit of space. So if you want more sky area, then I would say start your mountains a little bit lower. If you want more mountain area, then start your mountains a little bit higher and you'll have less sky. Sometimes paintings look a little funny if everything is completely equal. So that's one tip for you guys. So I might have just a little bit more sky and start my painting just a little bit below the mid zone there for the mountains. And all I'm going to do is just create some bumpy lines. So our first one, maybe I'll start over from this one. So I'm down a little bit from the midline here, and I'm just going to have it come up, and then it's going to kind of come down, and maybe we'll have another little bump, and then it might come up again and come down. And that's going to be our first little mountain area. And this does not have to be perfect at all. But just have some general idea. Now, if you want to go without the sketching part, you can just create your mountains by using your paint. But sometimes when you're beginning out in watercolors, it's helpful to have some lines, some kind of direction to help you. So our second set of mountains, we want to be down a little bit further. And maybe we'll have this one coming in, but not quite cross all the way, and then we'll have the next one come in. So I might have this one coming in a little bit higher, and then it comes down kind of like that, and then maybe we'll have this one coming in, and then it kind of comes down and across like that. So we'll have those two mountains crossing. And then for our bottom mountain, maybe we've got another mountain that kind of looks like that. So it'll just come like this and have a little bit of a wave and kind of go like that. Now I think I just want to fix this top mountain a little bit because it's kind of looking, I don't like that little bump there. So I'm just going to have this come up and just have like two little bumps instead. So I'll just go ahead and erase that. Now I'm trying to draw these lines out dark enough so that you'll still be able to see my line drawing. But when you do it, you want to have them dark enough so that you can see what's going on, but then you can go ahead and lighten them. So we can take a kneaded eraser here and just lighten, especially this top line here, because this is going to be our lightest mountain. So I'm just going to dab my kneaded eraser along here and just lighten this one a little bit. And then if you want to lighten any of your other lines, if you have a heavy hand when you're drawing, then you can always just go and lighten any of those lines. But these bottom lines here should be fine because we're going to be using a little bit darker paint there. Okay, so now that you have an idea of what you're doing, so we've got our sky and our mountains, we'll go ahead and mix up our color first, because we'll wet the background to do the sky so we can get a nice gradient from dark to light, and then we'll do our mountains afterwards. Today I've got my Winsor and Newton watercolors. I've got a couple of brushes off to the side here. I like to use this flat brush. This is a 3/4 size brush to wash my paper. And I've also got a size 12 brush here. This is just a round brush. Now these are silver black velvet brushes, but use whatever brushes you have. I'm probably going to use this to put the sky in, and then maybe to put the mountains as well. This has a very fine tip to it, so I'm still able to get a lot of detail even though it's a pretty big brush. However, if you've got to go down and use a size 4 or a size 8 brush, use whatever you have to for the size of the paper. You can draw this on a much larger scale and do a bigger picture as well, but I'm doing this in my Etchr sketchbook. Now this is 100% cotton paper, and it's one of my favorite sketchbooks that I've ever tried. So I'm just going to take this size 12 brush and start mixing up my phthalo blue. So this is the color that I've decided to use. You mix up whatever color you decide that you're going to use. So I've got some here. And I want this to be pretty watered down at first, so I'm just going to mix up a light amount here. And it's always nice to have your paint mixed up before you're ready to go, because if it takes you a little bit longer to mix the color that you want, then your paper could start drying, and then when you bring that paint over, it's not going to go as smoothly as you like. So I always like to have a little bit ready to go. Now this one's pretty easy because we're just using one color. I'm just going to leave my brush there because I've already got the paint on it and it's ready to go. So I'm going to dip into my clean water now using my flat brush, but you can use whatever brush you want. And I'm just going to wet the paper evenly, and I just want to go down as far as our first mountain here. Now I'm not going to bring the color down that far, but if any little traces of the color did get down there, it's not going to go on top of our mountains. But I'm planning to have this area right where I'm wetting now to stay the lightest in my sky. So I'm just going to take my time to wet all of the areas, and I don't want any puddles on the paper. But I want the paper to be nice and shiny and glossy. And that's the perfect stage to get your paper ready. And I might just do a little bit more down here. And then I can always dab this brush off onto the side. I have a cloth over here, just a clean cloth. And I just dab my brush off and then run over the surface one more time, just to pick up any extra paint on the paper or around the tape. So sometimes that's where you'll have some water pooling around your tape too, and that can create a little bloom. So we'll grab this brush with our paint ready to go, and I'm just going to start at the top here and gradually bring this down. So we're just going to start, and we're going to do a nice smooth gradient. I'm going to add just a little bit more of the dark color at the top here. And as I bring this down, I'm going to rinse my brush off in the water. So I'm going to show you. I'm going to rinse this off, and then I'm just going to run my brush off on the side. And then I'm going to coax this down just to get a really nice smooth gradient. Then I can dab my brush off too and start going the opposite way. And just making sure I have a really nice, smooth transition. Now, if you want to darken it, you can, or you can leave it like this if you want a nice light gradient of a sky. It's totally up to you. I think I'm going to leave it like this. So once you're happy with how your sky looks, then we're going to go ahead and let this dry completely. You can let it air dry, or you can take a heat tool or a hair dryer and dry it manually like that. Okay, so it's important for our paper to be completely dry at this point, especially down here along this first mountain, because that's where we're going to start. So if we start putting some wet paint in here and this area is still wet, then it's all going to bleed up into the sky, and that's not what we want for this. So just to make things easier for myself, I'm going to go down to my size 8 brush, and we're going to mix up a little bit more of this color. And I want it to be slightly darker than what we've used. Now, the easiest thing to do, especially when you're first beginning, and sometimes even when you're an advanced painter, is you always want to test your color before you put it down, because maybe this is way too dark. So I want to kind of test it and see if I need to add a little bit more water, and maybe I will add a little bit more water to this just to get this a little bit more watered down, and then I can test that color, and I kind of like that a little bit more. So it's a lot more lighter and more translucent, and that's what I'm going to use for our first area here. And I'm just going to paint this completely solid. So all of this area in here, I'm going to paint with this lighter color. Now you could do a slight gradient if you want, but just to make this super simple and easy, we're just going to do it all in one color, and we're going to do it wet on dry, because that's usually where a lot of people have trouble as well. Now what I want to make sure is my paint is wet enough so when I leave it here, there's a little bit of water left over, so when I go back in, I have time to kind of bring that paint back across the page, and it's not going to create like a harsh edge. And then when I introduce more paint into it, it's not going to bleed or create those blooms that we were talking about. So this is a great painting to kind of practice these techniques. So you can see there how there's still a little bit of paint at that edge, so I can move back down here and just pull this right back over, and we're just going to go all the way over to the edge. Now when we get to the edge here, I don't want to leave this pool of paint here, so I'm just going to dab my brush off onto the cloth so it's pretty dry, and I'm just going to suck this up, because if we leave that at the edge here, it's going to, once this starts drying, it's all going to suck back into that little mountain area. Now at this point, I would go ahead and let this dry completely, and then we'll come back and do our next little area. And once that's dry, we'll come back in and add a little bit more color to our paint. So we want it to be a little bit darker. I'm not trying to add too much more water at this point, but I want it to be slightly darker than it was before, and we can always use our strip here to test it. And I think that's going to be pretty good. And if not, we can always glaze another layer over it. And I'm just going to start here on this side and just fill in this little mountain here. And I'm just using the tip of my brush to create that nice sharp edge. And then I'm using the belly of the brush to follow my lines that I sketched out. Now, if your mountains don't come out perfect, don't worry about it. Every mountain is different. They're not all perfect, so it's totally fine. Your mountain can be whatever shape that you want it to be. There. So we're going to go ahead and leave that. Now, if I had a pool or a puddle here, I would suck that up with my brush like I did there. But I'm going to let this dry like this, and then we'll come back and do the other one. For this one, we're going to do the exact same thing. So I just dip my brush just enough, like the tip into the water, just so I've got enough water on my brush that I can pick up this paint here, because I've got to go a little bit darker than what we've got. Now I'm not adding any more water to this, because if I add more water to this, it's just going to dilute the paint, and I've already got enough water here. I just want to add more color. So this is teaching us some water control as well. And we can go ahead and just test this color down here. Now I think for this one, I want to go a little bit darker. And then our last mountain here is going to be our darkest value possible. So I think we can go a little bit darker on this one. So something like that, so you can see where we started and we're getting a little bit darker. Now, if you've got to add a little bit more water to this, like if you don't have enough paint, then you want to make sure you add more paint as well, and then just check your color again before you go on. And if you glaze over the exact same spot, even with the same ratio of paint to water, it will still darken up the color. So if you find that it's not dark enough once you start, don't panic, finish it, and then just glaze another layer of that color over top, and that will darken it up naturally. And this is helping to teach you to keep a steady hand while you're painting too. I don't always have a steady hand. A lot of my lines and my trees are very wonky, but I kind of like that look too. So these are all things to practice when we're beginning. And again, I'm working all of these edges because I don't want it to form a harsh line. And my paint is getting a little bit dry, so we will have to go in and mix up a little bit more. Okay, and if we go over the bottom one there a little bit, that's fine, because our bottom one is going to be our darkest. And then I'm just going to dab off and just pick up if I need to, but I think that's pretty good. So again, we're going to go ahead and let this dry completely. So now for this bottom one, we want this to be our darkest value possible. So I'm going to take just enough water so that I'll have enough paint to cover that area. Now, if you're already getting towards your darkest value here, you could always go ahead and add a little bit of neutral tint to it, just to darken it up. This is a very neutral color, so it works really well to darken up a lot of these colors, except for yellow. I find it just makes yellow go a little bit muddy, but you could always add that in and that will naturally darken up some of your colors. Or you could always try adding in the opposite color. So if you're using a blue, try adding in an orange, and that will darken it up a little bit, but it would also mute the color. So just keep that in mind. If you add a little bit too much, it will change the color. I'm just going to add enough water here, and then I've got to grab a very thick amount of paint here, very concentrated. So I'm adding a lot of paint here. So you could see how my water before was flowing around, but now when I put my brush through it, you can almost see a little bit of the palette. Not all the paint rushes through. It takes a few seconds, so that's what I want. This is pretty concentrated. So if we look here, we can just see the difference there. So once you've got the color that you want, then we're going to go ahead and just finish the bottom row here. And you can see how this one just really stands out. But because we're just using the one color, it's still going to stay pretty vibrant. And I really love this blue color. Now, if you find it too similar to the one before, again, we can use that glazing technique where we do another layer. And maybe I'll show you that here. And again, I'll rinse my brush off, dab it off onto my cloth really well, and then I'm going to pick up this extra paint that's pooling right there. And if there's any pooling over here as well. So at this point, you have to decide if you like the color difference down here, if you want to go a little bit darker. I'm going to go ahead and dry this, and then I'll come back and decide if we're going to glaze over another layer or not. Okay, so now that this bottom area is dried, I actually quite like the gradient that we have, and I don't think I'm going to glaze another layer over, but if you wanted to, at this point where it's completely dry, I would just pick up my paint and just do another layer over that, and it'll just darken it up enough. But let's go ahead and get our tape off, and then we can see what our painting looks like. I just use regular masking tape here in my sketchbook, nothing fancy. And if you're having trouble getting the masking tape off, then just use a little heat. So whether you're using a hair dryer to dry your paints or a heat tool, it will loosen up the glue in the tape and make it much easier to come off. Now, let me know if you want more beginner-friendly tutorials like this. And if you want to follow along with me in real time, I do have a Patreon where I post all of my tutorials in real time over there. And I do break down everything that I'm doing like this step by step so that anybody can really follow along with any painting that I'm doing. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, I will see you in the next one.